Happy New Year, everyone. I just wanted to make this video based on a class that I took, I want to say between November and December of last year, of 2023. And it was basically where a lot of the things that I got out of that class really was more of takeaways for me as a language teacher. And I want to share some of those takeaways with you as well. So the first things I really wanted to show is that, of course, this is an Italian class. This was actually one of the languages that they taught that I wasn't already at an advanced level at. So they had French, they had Spanish. They actually had medical Spanish, which I thought was really interesting. And they have 2 levels of Italian. And so I took the highest level because I've been learning Italian for about, I want to say 5 years now, on and off, or soon to be 6. But basically, when I took this class, my intention was I wanted to get better at speaking because when I took the class, it was more of just as a way of trying to figure out how to kind of get more confident speaking. And the teacher was actually from Bologna. So it was like, okay, so he's actually Italian. And one of the teaching assistants, or like he was there kind of like to help out, but he was actually from, I want to say, Tuscany. He basically was able to help him out in terms of like, especially when they're talking about cultures of different regions and things like that, because they're both from completely different areas within Italy. And so yeah, that was pretty much why I took the class. And it was also free because I actually tutor a kid once a week with his home. He's a high school student. I don't know why I say, to me, he's a kid, but he's really a high school student. And I help him with his homework like once a week. And so as a tutor, like for volunteering, you get a free class per season. So I chose to take that Italian class because I had taken that before the year before that, when that class was offered during the fall period. And when I took that class, there was a lot of things that I feel like I looked at, especially because, like, again, I had been learning it for several years prior to on my own. So there are things that, of course, you're going to know, and things that you are going to be like, oh, that's new, especially when it comes to the foundation of the language. So the first thing I really want to talk about is what did I like about the class? So part of it is like I would always get there early because my job is not too far away. So when I would get there early, it was more of just like sometimes I would see the teacher there beforehand. And so I would actually get some extra practice in speaking and listening and having a conversation and learning new vocabulary because there's some things I just couldn't explain. I'm like, I don't know this word. So he would explain it to me and show how to talk about that. I did really like how towards the end, like the very last week, because the very last week is always like a special week. But basically for us, it was just more of, he actually brought in some of his previous students who've taken that class, and they had actually gone to Italy. And so they had come in and basically just shared their experience of having taken the class and how it was helpful for them when they went to Italy. A lot of times I also realize is that there are people in that class who are also may not be at the same level as me. And when I say that, that does not mean I'm like better than anybody else. You are never better than anyone because we're all learning at different times. So of course we're going to be at different levels. So when you have a level 2 Italian class, you have people who are just starting to grasp certain concepts. Like the first thing he taught in the first week was passato remoto. Not remoto, passato prossimo. We learned the remoto later on, but the passato prossimo, which is like, if for me as a French speaker, that's kind of like basically passé composé. It's really the same. The grammar rules are the exact same. And there was another student in the class who was she actually sat next to me because I think she was originally from Haiti. And so she was still trying to struggle. She'd never taken an Italian class in her life. So, and so she was also in this level 2, like intermediate class. And so some people had already gotten certain concepts. And so I remember sitting next to her, kind of explaining it to her in French. So it's kind of weird. Like it's an Italian class, but I'm still speaking French because, again, people migrate and then they decide to take classes, So it's like, for me, it was good because I kind of got to work in 2 different ways. So I was explaining to her how avere and essere work, because it's kind of like avoir and être in the French context. So I was able to kind of give her more of like a French to Italian perspective, because I've also noticed that with some students that I've taught people who are Spanish speakers. And so I'm like, it's easier for me to explain this to you in this particular way. Because I remember I had a student who, she's Puerto Rican American, and so she preferred that I use Spanish to French rather than English to French, because it made a lot more sense to her in terms of trying to make those connections. Okay, so that was something that I really enjoyed, is that, you know, you have people who are all different levels relatively. Like, some people have had prior experience. There's one student in there who really was intimidating to me, and she was just like confidently speaking in Italian. She's speaking at a pace that I could understand for the most part. Because sometimes in Italian, I've noticed that with native speakers, it's very common for them to speak very quickly. Like, it just rolls off the tongue, and you're just like, you know, what are you saying? You know, and relatively, even at a native speaker level, I can pretty much understand bits and pieces to be able to put them together. And so on that end, and then I also have the fact that, you know, like she has like I think a daughter-in-law who's Italian. And so she was kind of like more so like learning and practicing with her. And she had taken that class previously as well. I think not at the time that I took it the first time. But I was just like, this person's she's just confidently speaking, and then she was sharing resources. And I feel like for me, I was just like, you know, like I've been learning this for 5 years. And that, you know, it's like, yeah, I've been learning it for 5 years, but the part of it is I just haven't had practice. And so I was, like I said, I was just really intimidated. I'm like, oh my gosh, she's speaking so confidently, you know. And so of course she's had practice. So again, there's that variation, and it's like you kind of almost help each other out, because it's like there's some people in there were couples who were taking this class together, and they were just saying like, I'm learning this so that we can retire and go travel to other places like Italy, you know. We went there, and so we're taking an Italian class because we really want to go back, and we want to be able to speak the language when we go back. So you get like you know, you get a varying amount of wide range of experience with just not only just the language, but just the culture. So that's what I really enjoyed most about it. And it was just it felt more of like a collaborative environment, because of course the teacher, he had certain things that he was going to go over as like main topics for that week. But then there's also the aspect of like things that students wanted to learn. So it's like I remember one time we were, the very first week of class, someone was looking out the window and said, "That's a beautiful sunset. What do you call that?" I was like, "Oh, il tramonto." I'm like, okay. So he wrote on the board, and he was talking about like those different aspects of like when you're talking about, you know, aesthetics, you know, things like that. So it's more student led, but it's like I said, there's a main topic, there's a main concept, but then it was just like very much like student led in terms of like, there's points where he was just talking, you know, about, you know, things that students wanted to know. So the next thing I would say is, you know, what would I improve about the class? And so again, I think it's a great class. And I think 5 weeks in general, there's only so much you can do in 5 weeks, and you meet once a week for an hour and a half. So that in itself is kind of a challenge. So one of the things I felt like I would improve is that, like, you know, the quality of the homework. Because I noticed that we had a lot of homework that involved translation. It was like, translate this from Italian to English and then vice versa. And I just felt like that's not necessarily helpful. Like, as a psycholinguistic, going back to my perspective on that, from a psycholinguistic perspective, is that, of course, like when you're trying to build freedom in how do you communicate the language, it really is not fully helpful if you're translating sentences that are set out by a certain teacher or by a certain, you know, like, you know, whatever. It's that, especially because a lot of them were like questions like, a lot of them were translating sentences like, we want to do this, or, you know, it was like some of it was like, I think a couple of them were song lyrics, you know. And there's certain things that I feel like for me, I would never talk about in a certain way, especially if you're trying to, like, it really depends on it. I guess I can understand that part of it was that he was using a lot of the homework as ways of like getting us to understand conjugation and how like they would work between different you know, subject pronouns. And that makes sense. But I also feel like what would have really helped is having homework where you have your students write their own sentences. And that can be a challenge, especially for beginners, because There's some people who told me, like, when they looked at the homework, they're like, I Google translated most of it because I didn't understand, or I didn't know certain vocabulary or things like that, which is perfectly fine, especially like with beginners. They're not going to know everything. And when you're expecting them to do things on their own, of course, they're going to resort to resources that they already have, like Google Translate, word reference, reversal context. There's so many translation tools out there that are already out there for you to be able to use when you need help. So on the other aspect, I just feel like it would have just been more challenging so that students could share, like when we would break up in groups and we'd go over the homework. So instead of going over and like translating each sentence, you know, like, okay, who's got number one? I feel like it's better to like for everyone to share on a certain topic. Because even for me, I specialize in beginners. So a lot of times I try to give them freedom to express, okay, what do you want to talk about? And I generate questions. I usually generate questions, like whether it be written or in speaking practice. I generate questions relating to what I know about them, because I do a lot of consultations with my students first meeting. You know, on the first meeting, I basically am saying, okay, I want to know more about you. Why do you want to learn this language? What do you already know from this language? Like some people, you know, they might have like, I've had some students who've had like 7 years of Spanish, and they're like, yeah, but I don't use it often and I'm not confident in it because I've never had to use it around native speakers or something like that. So a lot of times you have students like that where it's like they have experience, they know certain things. What do you do professionally? Because I deal with adults. What do you do professionally? Do you have a business? Some of them have kids. Okay, like, you know, how old are your kids? You know, those kinds of things. I asked them a lot of deep questions. Well, not like deep and like up close and personal, but I asked them a lot of questions specifically around, okay, like, tell me something about you so I can generate some questions for you to answer. So a lot of times, like with speaking practice, I might give them not necessarily speaking, but like writing practice, I might give them like YouTube videos to watch and have questions to you know, see what their comprehension looks like. And sometimes depending, if they're a beginner, I usually will write them in English, but then as they get further along, I start writing those questions in the target language so that they can kind of understand what someone's asking them and being able to answer, and then kind of going over the responses. So like if there's like if your whole thing, like where like your homework prompt is to talk about yourself, you know, and use and using certain conjugations, like whether using il presente or using passato prossimo, like talking about like things, like tell a funny story about something that's happened in your past, you know, like where someone feels like they're using it in a way that's useful for them and they have freedom to kind of say what they want to say. You know, I think you can give people a lot of prompts. There's a lot of things like ChatGPT. Like when I was at the World Language Teacher Summit last year in October, I mean, there was a whole day that was just presentations on AI, on how to use these resources to create teaching materials. Like, you know, like putting that in there and just creating prompts on things that students can write about. And you can, depending on what kind of context or type of concepts you want them to learn, you can get them to use that. Like, for example, it's like generating prompts on like, talk about such and such in passo remoto versus passo prossimo, or use these 3 types of conjugations. With Italian, I know there's like, kind of like French, there's multiple types of like past tenses. You know, you've got like French, you have like, you know, of course you have the passé composé, which I just talked about earlier. You have the imparfait, the imperfect. You have the plus que parfait, more than perfect. Then you have, I think there's like another one I usually don't talk about very much. It's like the passé antérieur, which no one really uses much. And there's like passé simple, which also no one uses anymore. But, you know, there's a lot of different types of past tenses. Same thing with Italian. So you can kind of like give them prompts around how, like, talk about this particular topic or talk about this, but use these particular things. So they kind of get them in using those types of things or those types of concepts or conjugations, but then you're also getting them to also use that in the context of them being able to use it relating to them. I also felt like having like conversations. Like, I think we had like maybe one time where we actually split off and did conversations, but it was more of like going over a scripted conversation. I think I have the packet with me. Actually, I didn't go over this with the part that I really like. So one of the things I really liked about the class was that they actually gave us a packet of a lot of useful things, and I took notes on it because it was like, well, we already have, because it makes it easier because like for students to reference it versus like dictation, you know, it's where it's like, all right, we're going to write sentences. So, you know, you see like, all right, So I am, you know, and then everyone has to write it down repeatedly, and it's like that's a waste of time when it's already here, so a student can actually go and look through, like they talks about the pronunciation of the alphabet. You have a whole alphabet chart, and then you highlighted the vowels, days of the week, months of the year, basic conjugation of like the auxiliary verbs, pronouns, possessives, plurals, question words, these types of things, like even just basic verb conjugation, like for regular verbs. There was some conversation practices in here, and things like that. So, conjugations of everything, that was really helpful. I do for sure say that was a very good thing to have, because that way we're not writing unnecessary notes when we can just be focusing on things that we want to learn. So I always feel like that's a great way as a teacher, is to start that off. A lot of times with my students, when I have beginners, usually what I'll do is I'll outline everything in a Google document. Sometimes I prep those documents, like there's certain things, because I know there's certain things I need to go over within that hour. And then other times there are, I just go through a blank Google Doc, and we're just going to have conversation practice, and I use it to like write down notes as we have conversations, because sometimes they might say, I don't know how to say this word. So I will write it out, and I'll tell them that and they'll be able to keep those notes. So they don't have to take notes themselves. I'm already writing it in a Google Doc. I share it with them. So like during that conversation practice, they can review and say, oh, there were certain words I didn't know, or these things I shouldn't go over, versus having to take those notes themselves. So in that process. So it's just kind of more or less, I just think that that's also a more effective thing. Because even when I noticed that, not even just in language learning, but also in like just classwork in general. As like when I was in college, I took this like computer pattern drafting class when I was in fashion school, and our teacher literally gave us a whole packet with detailed instructions on how to do everything, so that when she would do a demonstration, we weren't taking notes on every single step or in the process of how to use the system. That's just a concept I think is just great with any type of class that you're taking, so that when you go off and do your own thing, you're like, I just follow the steps here, versus trying to decipher my own notes. A teacher's notes sometimes can be much more structured and organized than a student's notes, because they're just trying to figure out what they're supposed to know. So overall, I think with takeaways, I think it was a great class. And even though there were a lot of things I knew and a lot of things that I felt like, because I took this class twice. I took it in the beginning, I think around the time that the pandemic ended, like around 2022. And then I took it again in fall of 2023. I kind of have the same, I don't know, like my thing is even though it was an easier, kind of like an easygoing class, I kind of looked at it from a perspective of, as a teacher, as a language teacher, kind of taking note on that. And like I said, I really enjoy the teacher. He's a lot of fun, and I love the fact that, of course, like speaking practice and getting used to that. And so for me, it was just mostly the challenge was just trying to speak more confidently. I mean, there are times where I really wanted to speak up and ask questions, and I wanted to ask it in Italian, of course, like, again, not everybody might understand. So sometimes the teacher will usually translate for the class, or he'll just kind of like go into response. Also, another thing that I think would have also helped is if the teacher one thing I realized is that if the teacher had more or less spoken a little bit more in Italian, like for me, I've noticed that with a lot of beginners, is that like, even for me, just as a language learner, I found a lot of YouTube videos that taught the language in the language, but they were just very visual about it. So like kind of going in and out, especially like with beginners, they may not understand everything, but if you're just kind of like going into the language and then explaining it in English and kind of going back and forth, so that way they're used to hearing it. So that by the time you get to the end of the class, like when the course is over, it's like, oh, like I understand everything you're saying, or I understand generally like maybe 80 to 90% of what you're saying, which is a really great goal to have. So in that particular thing, I think that would be one thing I would improve when it comes to language classes. It's just basically just speaking more in the language. And I get sometimes people explain things. They like to explain things to people in English, which is great, but also explain it both ways so that they can understand what you're talking about with that language exposure. So overall takeaways, I think it was, I feel like overall my rating would be probably about a 7 out of 10. like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed the class, but there were some times where I felt like I was bored because, again, we were going over, like, especially with the homework, going over, okay, like, translate this one and then go back and forth. And then, so sometimes I find myself, this is so awful. I felt myself kind of like hijacking the group because, like, there were times where I was just like, okay, so I have a question on this one. So, like, in this particular scenario, like, if we're talking, I mean, I know this sentence is talking about this, but I'm just saying if you were talking about something completely different, like, can I use it this way? Or, that kind of, or would I be able to use the same conjugation in this particular context? Or is this seems very similar to this type of thing? Because I just felt like I wanted to get the most that I could out of that class. And especially, like, because of course there's other people in there, like I said, with various skill sets, but it just felt like there's some things I want us to talk about because maybe that might be helpful for them, or this might be helpful for this particular person, to explain these types of things versus just going over translation, going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, who's got this answer, So I hope this is really helpful. And I think this is also really important, like when you're taking your own language courses, is to kind of evaluate how effective it is for you as a language learner. I'm obviously, like I said, after learning this language for so long and for years, and then, taking a intermediate class, I felt like in a way, like it wasn't very helpful long term. Like having taken this class a second time, it's like, okay, like I understand these concepts because we've gone over them before. And my main thing was just trying to get advanced speaking practice. And so I also think that's really important to consider, like the level of the class you're taking. Again, I took it because that was the highest level of the highest level for that language that they offered. So of course, you're going to be in that situation where you're going to be bored. So that's something to really consider. And also how helpful it is and how often is the teacher open to kind of deviating from the lesson. Because of course there's a main lesson, but then also like deviating based on what students need. So like how student-centered it really is. Yeah, I think my rating was 7 out of 10 was just basically because I just felt like I was a little too advanced for that class. Considering that there were other students as well. And one of the students actually said that they're going to start an Italian group where they just meet up at a cafe and start speaking Italian. So that was kind of something that kind of was good that came out of it. But would I take the class again? Probably. Like I said, I love the teacher. And so there might be certain things that maybe I could probably do to improve that class. So I don't know. So I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks for watching.